This is barbarian gold, and its discovery in Denmark has transformed our view of the Dark Ages. Ever since the Romans left Britain, people have been arguing about what happened next. Usually it's painted as a Dark Age, where life was nasty, brutish and short. But recent discoveries here in Yorkshire and across the sea in Denmark are painting a much more exciting picture. This is West Heslington, the largest Anglo-Saxon dig in England. It dates from just after the Roman Empire, when people used to think invading Saxons from across the sea wiped out the native Britons. But here at Heslington, they seem to have settled down with them instead. And the best way to see this is by looking at the houses. Most of them are not so different from the ones the Britons used, but some are of a type that can only have come with people from across the North Sea.
Oh, well, this is sort of, I suppose we might call a classic Anglo-Saxon house. It's a post-built building, and each one of these post holes contains 2 vertical planks.
Yeah.
This sort of building is, as far as we know, is not found generally on the continent. I think there are 2 candidates in the whole of Northern Europe outside Britain, but in England you find them on every Anglo-Saxon settlement. We think the antecedents are to be found in Roman Britain. There are examples of them in late Roman sites, and so it seems to be a native tradition. Over here, however, we have something quite different. This structure here, and we're standing in the middle of it, in what may be a passage through it, seems to be broken into 2 parts. A smaller block up at this end and then the larger area down here. And if that's true, then this one would appear to be of continental type and is the only one so far found in this country.
So we're talking about something a little bit like a Danish longhouse.
Yes, the same sort of basic idea. We're beginning to think that most of the population are in fact native people. During the Roman period they would have been Romano-British. Not necessarily running around in togas, but the same community that had been here since the Iron Age. But whoever is running the operation is probably a foreigner.
A foreigner from where?
From either Schleswig or Denmark or southern Sweden. We've looked at the Roman settlement, which is a kilometre away to the north, and there, right at the end of its life, we find Anglo-Saxon pottery in round houses. We find things known as Grubenhäuser, cavity floor buildings, which are a feature of early Anglo-Saxon sites. And then, say at about 450, and giving you precise dates is probably impossible, that completely disappears, and this new village is established at sites like this.
So the new village was built by a mixture of Saxons and Britons. And it's very different from what archaeologists had thought Dark Age villages were like.
We used to think, before we started, that it would be a scruffy collection of farmsteads lolling in the landscape. We now know that we have something that's almost like a planned town, because the village itself is divided up into a number of different zones. One for housing, one for industry, one for agricultural processing, and one behind us for something I'm not quite sure at the moment. It's almost like a sort of brave new world. All of a sudden, they're free to move, and they move on to sites like this, which are more elevated, they're drier, they're on slightly heavier soils, and they have a good aspect out across the valley. What we see here is not a sort of Dark Age scruffy hamlet with people living in holes in the ground. It's a sophisticated culture, a sophisticated village. And it is, although it has elements of what was here before, the structure is new and is quite different.
So at the level of ordinary rural society, this is actually an improvement.
I would think it's a rather more upmarket operation, as you might say.
If life did improve, it was because Britain had become part of a new world. Not the Mediterranean Roman Empire, but the Germanic North, with ties across the North Sea. And was that really such a disaster? Maybe we've been looking at the Dark Ages from the wrong end, seeing them from the Mediterranean as the dying gasp of the glorious Roman Empire. Here in the north, things seem very different, more like a golden age. In Denmark, here at Gudme on the island of Fyn, they've been finding gold. And when I say gold, I mean gold. Great gleaming lumps of it. This is the reality of the Dark Age in the north. Since 1982, more and more gold has been found at Gudme. which seems to have been a centre for the whole northern world. But how did the gold get there, and why? Danish archaeologists have been finding out.
We're right in the center of the biggest concentration of hoards of precious metals in southern Scandinavia. And the reason the National Museum are doing these excavations are to find out why did they bury golds and silver and precious jewelry right here. And what we do find when we are removing the topsoil is post holes, pits, traces of farmsteads, houses. We don't really know how big the village of Gudme are, but on each hilltop in this area we find traces of 3-4 farmsteads on each, and that would give something between 30 and 50 farmsteads in this area, between 500 and 1,000 people. These were not ordinary people. We can judge that by the finds. We find a lot of garbage from making silver and gold jewelry.
In the foundations of these apparently ordinary houses, the gold keeps coming up. But strangely, Peter Van Petersen hasn't found the home of the ruler of Gudme.
There might be a palace lying around somewhere, but we haven't found it, and we don't know really where to look for it. But we will do test excavations on every site where precious metals were buried, and perhaps we are lucky one day to find something that is really outstanding. A palace, perhaps. Who knows?
3 miles to the east, the Danes have found more evidence that Gudme was an important centre. Here at Lumborg was the port, a seasonal market where the gold arrived from across the sea. Black marks in the soil show the places where the craftsmen worked, and although it was only occupied in the summer months, this is the earliest port known in Scandinavia, 400 years earlier than Viking ports, but just as rich. The finds recovered from the earth show that they were building ships here. They were making glass, and they were working metal, including gold. So how and why did all the gold come to Lundborg and Gudme?
It came from the Roman Empire, and it must have got here by sea, of course, and whether it was as a tribute, or whether they stole it, or how they got hold of it, is something I can't decide. But we know, of course, that the Romans paid huge amounts of money to keep their neighbors quiet and keep them from attacking the crumbling Roman Empire.
What are they trading out in exchange?
Well, that I would like to know. The question is whether they really exported things from here, because the system may have been one where people came here to participate in religious activities, so that they may have brought these objects as offerings to participate in the religious sacred activities going on here. I mean, after all, Gudme means Gudhem in ancient Norse, means the home of God.
If Gudme was a religious centre, it must have been important for the whole Germanic world, for nowhere else has so much gold been found. And the kind of gold is significant. Some of the most beautiful objects are called bracteates. They're medallions with the images of God stamped on them.
We have on some of the gold bracteates from this island inscriptions in runic called Hauar, meaning the high, which is in the Viking Age one of the names that you give to the supreme god Odin. So presumably it was Odin who was the god here, but they didn't dare to call it the home of Odin, but they called it the home of God instead. The hoard from 1982 is a key find in that respect. Depicted gods in the act of healing. The ultimate healing is, of course, to awaken a dead person and make him alive again. And this is what some of the gold bracteates seem to show. You see the death of Balder, who was one of the Norse gods, who was killed by fraud, and who the central god Odin is seen trying to revive.
In England, as in Denmark, Odin, or Woden, was the chief god. He gave his name to Wednesday. And these pots from my own excavation in Norfolk confirm the connection. They're cremation urns, and their decoration exactly matches that on the Bracteate from Gudme. The same triangles, the same horseshoes. Perhaps they're magic symbols of healing and rebirth. It's easy to imagine Anglo-Saxons sailing back across the sea to worship at Gudme. After all, the earliest English poem is set in Denmark.
Of course, we have a famous English poem, Beowulf, which purports to be about Denmark. Do you think that a poem like that could have been set somewhere like Gudme?
Oh, I think it would be a reasonable fitting for it, yes, because, you know, in Beowulf they mention these gold glittering swords. I can't remember the exact wording. And the things that we find here, pommels and scabbard mounts, well, they would fit wonderfully with just that sort of image. So, well, I don't know if Beowulf wandered the fields here, but some of his contemporaries, I would certainly did.
The evidence from Gudme and West Heslerton shows that the world that followed the Romans was not a time of primitive decline, but a time of gold and epic heroes. Only if we look at it through classical eyes can we call it a dark age.
If you look at what we find here, we can't call that a dark age. It's glimmering with gold and silver and beautiful objects. So in that way, it was quite the reverse. This was the golden age of the North, really.